All right, welcome back to ABA exam review and the continuation of our BCBA mock exam. This is mock exam number 7. We're going to go through the next set of questions together and break them down. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. When you pass, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. The Liu family is flying home after the holidays with their several children. Father says to the children that he has a very special gift for each of them at home if they all behave on the flight throughout the entirety of the flight. What intervention is most represented here? So we have an intervention question and a pretty straightforward intervention question, I'd say. I don't think it's too complicated if we're fluent. And remember, fluency is always number one and our key to passing this exam. So, what do we know about our situation? Well, we know the Liu family's flying home. They have several children. The father says he has a gift if they all behave on the flight. And so, this is our key here because we're looking, of course, at a group contingency. Why is it a group contingency? Well, one, there are several children at once. And two, the contingency is based on the entire group doing something. So, with our group contingencies, we have our independent group contingency, where each member of the group is responsible for their own behavior. And if they engage in the correct response or behavior, they get rewarded. With the dependent group contingency or the hero contingency, one member of the group or a small subset of the group is responsible for the entire group. And then with an interdependent group contingency, the entire group must engage in the behavior. So, which one represents our situation? Well, with our situation, all the children must behave on the flight to get the special gift. So, the intervention that the father is looking for is going to be our interdependent group contingency because the contingency is all based on all of the children engaging in the correct target response. Diana, a behavior analyst, hosts a small group parent training every Tuesday night. For new parents, she wants to get an idea of the issues they are facing at home, so she has new parents complete a behavior and skill survey about their child or children. What type of assessment is this? All right, so an assessment question, when you think of assessments, think of preference assessments, and then think of our indirect, direct, and functional analyses. Now, a functional analysis is technically a direct assessment, but remember, it's a very specific type of direct assessment. And so we typically are going to think about direct assessments more of ABC recording and event recording. With that said, we know this isn't a preference assessment because there's no indication of any stimuli being assessed here. What we're looking at, or what Diana is looking at, is these parents and what are their issues they're facing at home. And so she's doing an assessment to figure out what will she be handling, what will she be tackling in these parent training sessions. In order to do that, the parents complete a survey regarding the behavior and skills of their children. So when we think surveys, what are we thinking? Well, immediately you should think, well, this is an indirect assessment. Indirect assessments typically involve interviews and surveys and checklists. We're not actually observing any of the behaviors or skills. A direct assessment, you actually go in and you observe the behavior or skill of interest. And of course, a functional analysis, we're actually manipulating things. And we're definitely not looking at manipulating antecedents and consequences here. So we have an indirect assessment. Now, we're going to get a little more specific here. Will this be an open-ended indirect or a closed-ended indirect? And it's not as complicated as it might sound initially. Just think about if we're doing an open-ended indirect assessment, we're going to be having a conversation. We're going to give in this case, the parents an opportunity to discuss and talk about, give their opinions, give their interview answers about their children. With the closed-ended, it's much more controlled, like a survey. There are specific questions and specific ways of asking these questions and answering these questions. So this assessment is much, much, much more close-ended than it is open-ended. So what type of assessment is this? Well, it's going to be a close-ended indirect. Examine the following diagram. The dashed lines in between R2 and R3 represent what? I like this diagram a lot. It's how I remember latency and into response time. Once you look at this diagram, try to picture it in your head moving forward. So we're looking at the dashed lines between R2 and R3. So we're looking at this right here. Now, we go from our SD to response 1. What would we call the time in between SD and response 1? Well, that's going to be our latency. Latency is the time in between the SD and the first response. Subsequent responses, so R1 to R2, R2 to R3, R3 to R4, so forth, so on and so forth, are called what? Are we looking at duration here? Well, no. If we were looking at duration, we would be looking at duration of each individual response, right? When we're looking at time in between SDs and responses or responses to responses, we're looking at latency or inter-response time. And so if you look at C, temporal extent, well, duration is just temporal extent, but it's derived from temporal extent. That's where we get duration. We're not looking at temporal extent or duration. We're looking at temporal locus. We're looking at the location in time. So the time in between the SD and the R1 is our latency. Therefore, our time in between the responses will be our inter-response time. Again, I think this particular diagram is the easiest way to remember latency versus inter-response time. You're looking at time in between a point in time. And so once you've gone from your SD to your responses, and now you have your time in between each subsequent response, you simply go from latency to your inter-response times. Jerry Seinfeld is set to do a stand-up act following a flight to Milwaukee. Jerry's assistant tells Jerry that the pilot will be in the audience for the act. When Jerry notices the pilot, he is suddenly unable to perform his routine as well as he usually does in front of a large crowd. What is potentially happening due to the pilot's presence? The question is asking about what is happening to the pilot's present. Notice we always start with what is the question asking? Where we want to start. We never jump to answer choices. Once we know what the question is asking, we then ask, what do we know? So what do we know about the pilot's presence? We know Seinfeld is going to do a stand-up act. Jerry's assistant tells Jerry the pilot will be in the audience for the act, so the pilot is in the audience. And then when Jerry sees the pilot or notices the pilot, he can't perform his routine in front of a large crowd. So typically, Jerry gets on stage, there's a large crowd, he does his routine well. Now, Jerry has the pilot sitting there. Jerry can no longer engage in his typical response, even though there's typically stimulus control due to the large crowd and perhaps even the stage and the environment. But in this case, the pilot is doing what? Well, the pilot is masking Jerry's ability to do a stand-up act. It's masking the stimulus control. Overshadowing on the, it's not the opposite, but the difference between masking and overshadowing is overshadowing stimulus control is not yet established. So if stimulus control is not yet established and something is preventing stimulus control from being established, that is overshadowing. With masking, there's already stimulus control. So Jerry already can do his routine in front of a large crowd, but today the pilot is masking that stimulus control. With stimulus salience, that's just the magnitude or the amount of presence of the stimulus in the environment. So in this case, even though the pilot is in the audience, the pilot is very salient to Jerry because it's a big presence in that environment. But that's not what's happening to Jerry. What's happening to Jerry is his stimulus control, the stimulus control of the crowd, is being masked by the pilot. So be very careful with that wording. And then over selective stimulus control is when somebody is too precise about a certain characteristic of a stimulus. So if you, for example, show a child a toy car and they're focused only on the tires, and that's what has stimulus control over a car, that is over selective stimulus control. In this case, again, the pilot is masking Jerry's ability to perform his stand-up routine. With overshadowing, stimulus control is not yet established. Stimulus salience just refers to the amount or magnitude of the presence of the stimulus in the environment. And then over selective stimulus control is too much focus on one characteristic of a stimulus. These ideas are challenging. We don't talk about them a lot in practice. So if you're struggling with these, go back and review. But this is one of the areas where I recommend almost studying last, the idea of masking and overshadowing a stimulus salience, because you can really get confused and bogged down, which you don't want to do. If you get the question right, that's fantastic. Keep it up. If not, no big deal. That's why we're practicing. Go back, review stimulus control and the different ideas behind stimulus control. Alfred and Germain are discussing why they believe a client is suddenly pulling out their hair. Alfred says the client may be wanting to escape and that the client also feels nervous. Germain says escape is possible, but that the client's feelings aren't to be considered in their analysis. Germain is adhering to what school of behaviorism? Worried about who here? Because we have two people in this question. When you have more than one person, you always have to ask yourself, well, who am I concerned with? We're concerned with Germain. And what is Germain adhering to? What school of behaviorism? And when we think about our schools of behaviorism, we have radical behaviorism, which is what we practice because we acknowledge private events in our analysis. With methodological behaviorism, even though private events may exist, they aren't included in the analysis. So in this case, Alfred and Germain, they have to figure out why the client is pulling out their hair. Alfred says, well, it's for escape, and the client feels nervous. So we have a private event, this nervous feeling. Germain says, well, sure, escape is possible, but the client's feelings are not to be considered. So if Germain doesn't want to consider the client's feelings in the analysis, then what school of behaviorism is Germain adhering to? Well, there's not going to be radical behaviorism because in radical behaviorism, private events can be and or often should be considered in the analysis. Now, don't get it confused with the practice of ABA where we don't typically measure or focus on private events because we can't see them. That's not meaning they're to be ignored because they are part of behavior. The only difference between private and public events is that observability factor. When Germain says, well, don't consider it in the analysis at all, then she is encroaching into methodological behaviorism territory. So it's not both and it's not neither, but Germain is adhering to this idea of methodological behaviorism. Arnie wants to start a new workout routine as his New Year's resolution. He asks his girlfriend to give him $1 every time he wakes up before 5 a.m. and to not give him $1 when he wakes up after 5 a.m., starting January 1st. What describes the intervention used in this scenario? We have another intervention question. What do we know so far? We know Ernie is starting a new workout routine. His girlfriend is to give him $1, waking up before 5 a.m., being reinforced, and to not give him $1 whenever he wakes up after 5 a.m. So reinforcement is being withheld when he wakes up after 5 a.m. What do we call that when we reinforce a target behavior and put other behaviors on extinction? Of course, it's differential reinforcement. And with differential reinforcement, you first ask yourself, am I teaching a new behavior? Am I teaching a replacement? In this case, that answer is yes. We're teaching the behavior of waking up before 5 a.m. And so when we teach a new behavior, it either has to be an incompatible DR or an alternative DR. If you aren't teaching a replacement, then it can be other, it can be lower rates, it can be diminishing, or it can be higher rates. Here, we're teaching this replacement behavior of waking up before 5 a.m., so we're going to focus on incompatible or alternative. If we look at A, differential reinforcement of other behaviors, DRO, DRO occurs when you get reinforced or you reinforce somebody for a behavior not happening. In this case, he's got to wake up before 5 a.m. Ernie has to wake up before 5 a.m. to get the reinforcement. So it's not a DRO because he's actually got to engage in this target behavior to be reinforced. So is this incompatible or alternative? Well, the only difference between incompatible and alternative is that the replacement behavior either can happen alongside the old behavior or it can't. If it can't, then it's incompatible. So the question is, can you wake up before 5 a.m. and wake up after 5 a.m.? Well, of course not. You're either going to wake up before 5 a.m. or after. So these are incompatible behaviors. The intervention being used is going to be incompatible. It isn't lower rates of behavior because we're teaching a new behavior. We're trying to teach or increase Ernie's ability to wake up before 5 a.m., not lower the rate of an already existing behavior. So, Ernie's girlfriend is going to be using differential reinforcement of incompatible behaviors. Thank you so much for watching. Please check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials. Subscribe for all of our videos. Let us know when you pass so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. We'll see you soon.